Why did your bread turn out like this, hard and flat, instead of this nice, soft, fluffy dinner roll? And when you open it up, it's crumbling like a biscuit. Hello and welcome to Jackson's Job. What if I told you it's not you, it's not the recipe, it may be your yeast? All 4 of these yeast are dry yeast. However, each one of these need to be treated differently. Let's look at this active dry yeast. In order to use active dry yeast, you have to activate it. If you think of the word activate, it will always help you remember that you have to dissolve this yeast in warm liquid before you proceed. If you do not do that, you will not get a great rise to your bread, no matter how well you follow the recipe. Then we have fast rise yeast. This is basically dry yeast that they want you to put warm liquid in to speed up the process. The problem with fast rise yeast is, 1, you cut out the flavor. Flavor is developed by the off-gassing of the yeast, and that takes time. The second thing that can happen is you can lead to overproved or collapsed bread. Then we have dry yeast, where you add it to your dry ingredients, and then you will add liquid. And depending on which manufacturer you choose, they will tell you what temperature they want that liquid to be. So you could be starting out with a solid recipe, but because of the yeast you chose at the market, you may have horrible results. And that comes down to the fact that each yeast has a preference on how it is proved. So let's do some experimenting. Today in our house, it is 75 degrees Fahrenheit. That's roughly 24 degrees Celsius. Then we are going to heat up some water to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 43 degrees Celsius. And finally, we're going to heat up some water to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 49 degrees Celsius roughly. We have 3 containers with the exact amount of liquid. 2 of them have room temperature water, remember 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 24 degrees Celsius. And 1 of them has 110 degrees Fahrenheit or 43 degrees Celsius. To these containers, I'm going to add in equal amounts of yeast and sugar. The sugar is only there to feed the yeast. I am adding in instant dry yeast into room temperature water, active dry yeast into room temperature water, and then active dry yeast in water that is according to the package instructions. And then I'm going to do a time lapse over the next 10 minutes. Notice how both the left and right are growing at different rates, but they are feeding. And if you look at the active dry yeast in the middle, it's not even doing pretty much anything other than dissolving into the liquid. Do you see where this could become a problem in your bread making? Let's look at it up close. The instant dry yeast that you're supposed to add to dry ingredients doesn't look like it did much, but it did do more than the active dry yeast that was just added to room temperature water. However, if you look at the active dry yeast on the far right, it is nice and foamy and bubbly, and it is happy and ready to start making bread. So what happens if we would take this and put it into the exact same recipe? That's what I'm going to do for you. First up is our active dry yeast, 75 degrees Fahrenheit or 24 degrees Celsius. I'm going to pour it into the flour, and then I'm going to stir this 100 times. And I'm going to do this for every single thing I make. I used identical amounts of flour and identical amounts of water for each one of these. Notice the flour is having a hard time absorbing the water. And when we look at it in the end, it's going to be not completely mixed together. You're going to see some dry bits of flour, but to be consistent, we're only going to stir this 100 times. Let's move on to the active dry yeast that has been heated. Again, I'm going to stir it 100 times and then put it into a pan. Already, I am getting results that I was expecting. This is a much stickier dough, and it is coming together very well. At the end, when I put it in the pan, it is exactly the consistency I was looking for originally. Then we're going to move on and we're going to do the instant dry yeast that we dissolved earlier in room temperature water. Same thing, stir it up 100 times, put it in a pan, set it aside. Again, this one looks pretty good. It's nice and sticky, exactly like I expected it to look, and I'm not sure what happened to that active dry yeast. Now we're going to use instant dry yeast, but this time we're going to add the yeast directly to the dry ingredients and then add in the water. Again, we're going to stir 100 times and then move on. Then we are going to do the fast instant dry yeast. We're going to heat our water to 120 degrees Fahrenheit or 49 degrees Celsius. And we're going to do the same steps. We're going to add in our water and then we're going to stir 100 times and put it in a pan. Now all of them except for the active dry yeast have been a very sticky dough just like I anticipated, and I think they're all going to turn out pretty good. The first one is the active dry yeast, again at room temperature. The second one is active dry yeast according to the manufacturer. The third one is instant dissolved dry yeast at room temperature. The fourth one is instant dry yeast as per the instructions. And the last one is the fast acting dry yeast, heated up per instructions. Let's cover this up with some plastic wrap and come back an hour later. Let's look at the difference between the yeast. Which one do you think is going to turn out well in the oven? I already have my suspicions these two are not going to turn out well, but it's okay. Sometimes things puff up in the oven and surprise us all. Trying to make this as consistent as possible, I'm going to put this on a cookie sheet. That way they all have a reflective surface and bake pretty much the same way. So I'm going to bake these for 35 minutes and come back and let you see the difference. 35 minutes later, we have some pretty good looking rolls here. I'm pretty happy with how they turned out, aren't you? But the proof comes in how they look after they have cooled down. I'm going to let them sit here for 5 minutes, turn them out, we'll look at the texture, and then I'm going to let them cool completely and we'll cut them open. Something I'm noticing about the two that didn't rise properly, there's a little bit of burning on the bottom. They're not quite there, but there are parts where they are very dark brown and not very good looking. Look at this one that was made with the active dry yeast that wasn't activated. You can see the flour that never fully absorbed and it's quite dense. The second one is the instant dry yeast that was dissolved in water without any regard to following the directions of the manufacturer. These last three, we followed the manufacturer's instructions. Now some of them are a little bit taller than others, but that's not going to make or break your recipe like ignoring the instructions will. They honestly have a really good height to them, a good coloring to them, and I suspect when we cut them open, they're going to have a great crumb structure. So that's what we're going to do next. First up, we have the active dry yeast that we did not activate. This was done at room temperature. Look how close that structure is, and if you look at the bottom, it's underproofed because it's a very tight structure. If this bread had risen properly, it would have a nice open, airy crumb structure and not this really tight micro crumb. This is going to lead to a more dense and chewy texture. This is the instant dry yeast. Again, we didn't follow the instructions on the packet. It does have a better crumb structure than the active dry yeast, but it's not what I was expecting. It's not uniform, but when you press on it, it's got a good rise to it. And when you pull it apart, it's starting to look more like what I was expecting, more like bread and less like a biscuit. Now these two already look better. They have a great crumb structure, and so does this final one. Actually, the final one is starting to collapse if you noticed. That is because it is the fast-acting yeast. Let's stack them up all together so you can see the difference. Every single one of them will give you a good tasting bread, but some of them will be more disappointing than others. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you for watching, and as always, happy baking.